Spider-Man Homecoming is another reboot of Spider-Man that is inside the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is basically his initiation into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's directed by Jon Watts and stars Tom Holland, Michael Keaton, Robert Downey Jr. This movie takes place right after the events of Civil War. It's after he did that whole battle, and now Tony Stark sort of appointed him as this tiny hero that does very small-scale missions out in New York City. He's not the big Spider-Man yet that saves the whole city. He just solves very little small-scale problems. Like if an old lady's cat is stuck in a tree, Spider-Man will go by and help the cat, basically. That's the sort of problems he does right now. But Tom Holland wants to be more than that. He wants to be an Avenger. He wants to be up with the big leagues of Tony Stark and the rest of them. So he's basically trying to prove himself to Tony Stark by stopping this big bad guy in New York City called the Vulture. While all this is happening, he's also dealing with high school. He's dealing with friends, he's dealing with bullies, he's dealing with his crush that he has on a girl. He's dealing with all the stuff that Spider-Man normally deals with, and this is basically an origin story of how he goes from Spider-Boy to Spider-Man, basically. So I was obviously really looking forward to Spider-Man Homecoming. If this movie wasn't in the MCU, I wouldn't be looking forward to it, because we've wanted so long for Spider-Man to be part of the MCU, and it took them so long to do that. Everyone was asking for it, and this is finally the time that Spider-Man can finally be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and have his own movie among the Avengers. We've wanted this for so long because Amazing Spider-Man didn't treat his character right, and I am a huge fan of Spider-Man. Spider-Man, I think, is my second favorite superhero right under Batman. Batman is my favorite, and then Spider-Man is my second favorite. I'm a huge fan of the character, which is probably why I haven't liked a Spider-Man movie in 12 years.
I did my waiting! 12 years of it!
You heard me right. It's been 12 years since Spider-Man 2 came out in 2004, and after that with Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man, they really weren't up to par as I'd like them to be. Because Spider-Man is one of my favorite superheroes, and those movies just did not do him justice, and all three of them are not very good. So Sony was like, hey, screw it, let's finally give Spider-Man back to Marvel, and this movie actually knows how to treat the character of Spider-Man. This movie actually knows how Spider-Man should be, which is great to see after 12 years of not getting another good Spider-Man movie. Seeing Spider-Man being treated right on the big screen was the most enjoyable thing about this movie. Tom Holland is awesome as Peter Parker and Spider-Man. I'd say he's just as good as Tobey Maguire. I think I like Tobey Maguire slightly more because his Parker was just so incredible, but Tom Holland, if anyone said Tom Holland was better than Tobey Maguire in this movie as the character of Spider-Man and Peter Parker, I wouldn't really argue, because he's really good at capturing the nerdy side and the Spider-Man side. He's very funny, he's also very nerdy and awkward and not very popular. He really sold that character well, especially the humor. This is the funniest Spider-Man has ever been. Tom Holland is hilarious in this movie, and he's really great in the role. The thing that makes Spider-Man so great is that he's relatable. He's relatable to the common people. That's the thing that Stan Lee always said about Spider-Man, is the best thing about him is that he has everyday problems. He deals with high school, he deals with girls, he deals with bullies, he deals with work at school. Tom Holland really sold that in this movie. This is definitely more of a high school movie. This is a high school oriented movie, and it really worked. You can tell that Jon Watts actually took inspiration from movies like The Ferris Bueller's Day Off or Breakfast Club, any John Hughes movie back in the 80s. You can tell he took a little bit of inspiration from that and tried to make a high school movie more in that setting where it's very realistic interpretation of high school. This movie is very good at interpreting high school. Every scene where I saw Peter Parker walking through high school and talking to kids, I was like, that is it. And another thing I really appreciate about this movie is that everyone looks like they belong in high school. Even though I love the first two Sam Raimi movies, they're really, really good movies, but everyone who was in high school was clearly like 30 years old. They didn't look like they were in high school at all, but this is the first Spider-Man movie to actually have kids look like they are in high school. It's the most realistic interpretation of high school by far that we've gotten. Parker's friend in this movie, Ned, who's sort of a little bit of a sidekick character, he is a perfect interpretation of what high school kids are like at that age. I can't praise this enough because this movie wasn't trying to be like the same story we've seen a million times. Like, basically, one of my biggest problems with Amazing Spider-Man is that it tried to recreate the story from the first Spider-Man and did it much worse. and much crappier, this movie doesn't try to recreate anything. This tries to make its own movie. It doesn't concern itself with Uncle Ben and all that stuff. This is not an origin story about Spider-Man's powers. It's more of an origin story about how he became an Avenger, basically. It's sort of his initiation into the Avengers, and I really like that change of pace. The movie is also very funny. There were parts where I laughed really hard at this movie. It's almost as funny as Guardians of the Galaxy, I'd say. The humor is that prevalent in this movie. This movie is funny constantly, especially because Tom Holland is so witty and he's so funny. Anyone who complained about Tobey Maguire and said, I want more quips, they will be happy with Tom Holland in this movie because he tells tons of quips. He is so funny in this movie. Everything in this movie is really funny and lighthearted, and that's what Spider-Man should be. It embraces the cheesiness of that character. Also, another thing I really liked about this movie is that Robert Downey Jr. is very minimal in this movie. He only has like maybe 5 scenes or so, something like that, and he's not in the movie that much, actually, which is something I was worried about going in because I thought he was going to be like in all of the movie. I thought he was going to be like Spider-Man and Iron Man teaming up. A lot of people were afraid that it would be an Iron Man 4, and it absolutely isn't. This feels like a Spider-Man film. It's a Spider-Man-centric film, and Robert Downey Jr. was sort of just like, he made a few appearances as sort of his little bit of a father figure that he doesn't have anymore since Uncle Ben passed away. Robert Downey Jr. and Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan are minimal in this movie, but their appearances were really good. I liked the appearances a lot from them because they didn't overplace them in the movie like a lot of people were afraid of, myself included. The action in this movie is also tons of fun. It's so much fun. This is the best Spider-Man action scenes we've seen since the original first 2 Spider-Man movies. I wouldn't say it's as memorable or as great as the original 2 Spider-Man movies because those movies, there are so many action scenes in those movies that I really remember. I mean, Spider-Man 2 has some of the best action scenes ever made, probably, in a comic book film. But the action in this movie was really serviceable. They did a really good job with the action and tried to make it as good as they could, even though it doesn't quite live up to the first 2 Raimi movies, but it's kind of hard to do that anyway, because they were so good. Also, another thing that I really liked about this movie is that Michael Keaton was actually very good. One of the things I was worried about going in was that this would be another generic Marvel villain because that's their kryptonite. They're really bad with villainous characters, but Michael Keaton in this movie was constantly interesting. I really liked where his character was coming from. I feel like if Michael Keaton wasn't cast in this role, he wouldn't be as interesting as he was, but the fact that he is Michael Keaton just makes him all the more interesting because Michael Keaton is an incredible actor and he did a really good job in this movie, and he really likes playing winged creatures like Batman and Birdman. I'd say my only problem with Michael Keaton's character is that I wanted a little bit more from him. His motivation is a little rushed, it was glossed over a little bit. I wanted him to be in the movie a little bit more, but while he's there, he does a really good job, especially towards the climax of this movie. I was terrified of this guy. He has some moments where he is really scary, actually, which is something we haven't seen in a Spider-Man movie since, well, Spider-Man 2, because all the villains after that sucked. But I've already explained some of my little nitpicks and gripes with this movie. This isn't a perfect movie. This isn't the best Spider-Man movie ever. Sam Raimi's first 2 movies are easily still the best Spider-Man movies, but this still is a really good movie that understands the character and the comic book and the source material that it's trying to make an adaptation of. This is a movie that's really, really fun, even though it's not perfect. So let me get into the problems I have right now. My main problem with Spider-Man Homecoming is that it's more predictable than the other Spider-Man movies. I'd say the first 2 Raimi movies, you constantly didn't know where those were gonna go. They were so weird at times. Sam Raimi often chose really weird choices that were really cool, like the raindrops keep falling on my head scene. I feel like Raimi definitely had more of a style to his first 2 movies. Those movies were a lot less predictable, they had a lot more emotion, they had a lot more energy to them, and this movie doesn't quite have as much as I wanted, because there are definitely some downtime in this movie, and it doesn't move as fast as the first 2 Spider-Man movies, because those movies were constantly moving, they were constantly entertaining for the whole time. This movie definitely does have a little bit too much downtime. I felt like it was a good change of pace, because I didn't want Spider-Man to be the same thing again, but there are definitely some moments where it does drag a little bit, which is a little bit of a problem because in the original 2 Raimi movies, it never dragged at all. There are also a few characters that I wanted a little bit more to, like Spider-Man's love interest in this movie is just kind of a girl. She's a person. Mary Jane in the original Spider-Man movies, she had a character. She had dreams, she wanted to be an actress, she was abused at home, she hated her normal life. And even Gwen Stacy in The Amazing Spider-Man, played by Emma Stone, one of the most likable actresses of all time, is really good in those movies. She's my favorite part of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, even though those movies aren't very good. And this new love interest, Liz, I think her name is easily the weakest out of the three. I felt like there was nothing to her character. I wanted a little bit more to her character. They have a little bit of a romance between Tom Holland and her. He obviously has a crush on her in this entire movie, but I never really understood why he had such of a crush on her, because she was just fine in this movie. You barely even know the character, and she's integral to the plot, so definitely when stuff happens later in the movie, I felt like I wanted to know her character more, and then I would have felt for her more. Her character is just a serviceable, fine love interest. I wanted a lot more from her. Even when Tom Holland and her had their moments together, I didn't really feel much chemistry. I thought they were just fine. They were just like, yay, Marissa Tomei as Aunt May also does a fine job. She's nothing compared to the original Aunt May, but she does do a fine job. She has a few funny lines in there. There are also a lot of moments in the first act where they really focused on Michael Keaton's henchmen. He has like this guy on his side called the Shocker, and everything involving them I really didn't care about. I felt like they focused a little bit too much time on them, and it did drag a lot because I didn't really care about his henchmen at all. I only cared about Michael Keaton himself. So when they tried to focus on the henchmen, I felt like, yeah, you could have just cut that out of the movie, and they would have moved faster. Like I said, Spider-Man Homecoming does have problems, and they did play it safe, but the things I really liked about this movie is that it's so much fun, it's so funny, it absolutely understands the Spider-Man character, and it did something more different than I expected. Even though it is predictable at times, it did something that was a lot more different than the other Spider-Man movies, so I was glad that they didn't do the exact same thing. Michael Keaton in this movie is really great, even though I wanted more of him. Spider-Man Homecoming is a good movie. I want to reiterate that. This movie is tons of fun, despite its problems. There's so much fun things in this movie, and I walked out of this movie really happy that we finally got to see Spider-Man good again. I'm gonna give Spider-Man Homecoming a B+. Like I said, Spider-Man is one of my favorite superheroes. He's my favorite right under Batman, but this movie does have problems, but I'm just so glad that we finally got a good Spider-Man movie again, and I can't wait to see where else they take the character in this universe, whether it be the Avengers movies or Spider-Man Homecoming 2, if that's going to be a thing. Alright guys, if you like this video, be sure to like it, be sure to subscribe, be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I am gonna go walk outside now. I'm gonna go walk in my backyard. So, see ya!
Raindrops are falling on my head, and just like the guy's feet are too big for his bed, nothing seems to fit. Those raindrops are falling on my head, and they keep falling. So I just did me some talking to the sun, and I said I didn't like the way he got things done. He's sleeping on the job.